Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey to a windswept island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, to a place where over 100 English men, women, and children simply vanished, leaving behind only a single word carved into a wooden post. We travel to Roanoke Island in the year 1587, to America's first mystery, to the haunting story known as the Lost Colony. But before we begin this journey into one of history's most enduring mysteries, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue these explorations of forgotten history, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world you are and what time it is as you listen. Feel free to share in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to 1590, to an August morning on Roanoke Island, to witness one of history's most haunting discoveries. Imagine standing on the shore of Roanoke Island on an August morning in 1590. You are John White, an artist, a governor, a grandfather. You have just returned after 3 years away, 3 years during which you fought desperately to get back to this place, back to your daughter Eleanor, back to your infant granddaughter Virginia Dare, back to the 115 colonists you left here with promises that you would return quickly with supplies. Picture the scene as your ship anchors offshore. You scan the island anxiously, looking for signs of life, smoke from cooking fires, movement in the settlement, people running to the shore to greet your arrival. But you see nothing. The forest is silent. No one comes. Your heart begins to pound with dread. You take a boat to shore with several crew members. The settlement was built near the northern end of the island, protected from storms by the maritime forest. You remember leaving it 3 years ago, houses under construction, a palisade being erected for defense, gardens being planted. You remember your daughter's face as you said goodbye, her promise to care for baby Virginia, her trust that you would return soon with supplies and more colonists. As you approach the landing place, you notice something strange. The beach is empty, but not abandoned. There are no signs of violence, no scattered belongings suggesting hasty flight, just emptiness, silence, the lapping of waves against the shore, and the crying of gulls overhead. You climb the sandy path toward the settlement. The forest closes in around you, live oaks draped with Spanish moss, twisted cedars shaped by constant wind, dense undergrowth. This is not the ordered English countryside you remember from home. This is wilderness, thick and strange and indifferent to human presence. And then you see it, the wooden palisade you ordered built before you left. It still stands, more or less intact, but the gate is open. No guards watch from the walls. No sounds of daily life, no voices, no tools. No children playing come from within. You enter the settlement with your heart in your throat. The houses are still there, but they're empty. Roofs need repair. Doors hang open. Inside the buildings, you find some personal items, but not many. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of what happened or where the colonists went. And then, on a post at the entrance to the fort, you find it. A single word carved into the wood in capital letters. CROATOAN. Picture yourself staring at this word. It's not a cry for help. It's not a warning. It's a place name, CROATOAN Island, about 50 miles south, where a friendly native tribe lives. Before you left 3 years ago, you'd made an agreement with the colonists. If they needed to leave Roanoke, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they were in distress, they would add a Maltese cross above the word. There is no cross, just the word. CROATOAN. What does it mean? Did they go there willingly? Were they forced? Are they alive? Is your daughter alive? Your granddaughter, who would now be 3 years old, is she safe? You want to sail immediately to CROATOAN Island to search for them. But a storm is approaching. Your ship's captain, nervous about the dangerous waters and the lateness of the season, refuses to attempt the journey. You'll have to wait, he says. Return next year when conditions are better. You never return. War with Spain, lack of funding, age, and exhaustion, various factors prevent you from ever making another voyage. You will die in 1593, never knowing what happened to your family, to the colonists you left behind. Your last sight of them was in 1587. They have vanished as completely as if they never existed. This is where our mystery begins. To understand why the Roanoke colonists came to this dangerous shore, we must first understand Elizabethan England, a nation on the rise, hungry for empire, yet far behind Spain and Portugal in the race for New World riches. Picture England in the 1580s. Queen Elizabeth I has ruled for nearly 30 years, guiding her small island nation through religious wars, political intrigue, and constant threat from Catholic powers who question her legitimacy. England is Protestant in a Europe divided by faith. Spain, wealthy and powerful, controls vast territories in the Americas and sees Protestant England as both heresy and competition. The Spanish have been extracting gold and silver from Mexico and Peru for decades. Treasure fleets sail regularly from the Caribbean to Seville, carrying wealth that makes Spain the most powerful nation in Europe. English privateers, essentially government-sanctioned pirates like Francis Drake, raid these ships and settlements when they can. But this is theft, not empire. England has no colonies of its own in the New World, no permanent settlements, no claim to the riches everyone knows exist across the Atlantic. This galls ambitious Englishmen who see their nation falling behind in the great competition for wealth and power. Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier and favourite of Queen Elizabeth, is one such man. He's charismatic, intelligent, ambitious beyond measure. The Queen has granted him a charter permission to establish colonies in the New World, to claim land for England, to find wealth and glory. Raleigh has sent expeditions before. In 1584, explorers returned with glowing reports of a land they called Virginia, named for Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, a coast of abundant fish, fertile soil, friendly natives, and mild climate. These reports are exaggerated, sometimes deliberately false, designed to attract investors and colonists. But people want to believe. England needs this dream of empire. Picture the kind of person who would join such an expedition in 1587. You might be a younger son of a gentleman's family, with no inheritance prospects. You might be a craftsman seeking opportunity denied you in England's rigid class system. You might be fleeing debt, scandal, or religious persecution. You might simply be young and adventurous, drawn by tales of a land where ordinary men might become wealthy, where society's constraints don't yet exist. Or perhaps you're a woman, wife, or daughter of a colonist with no choice in the matter. When your husband or father decides to seek fortune in Virginia, you must follow or be left behind. You'll leave everything familiar, your home, your family, your friends, the landscape you've known all your life, for a place you can barely imagine based on travelers' tales and crude maps. The expedition assembles in 1587. John White, an artist who'd been on previous voyages, is appointed governor. He's 50 years old, experienced in New World travel but no soldier or political leader. His authority comes from Raleigh's appointment and the colonists' willingness to follow him. His daughter Eleanor is going, along with her husband Ananias Dare. She's pregnant, will give birth to the first English child born in the New World, a daughter named Virginia Dare. There are 117 colonists in total. Men, women, children, entire families, not just adventurers. This isn't meant to be a temporary military outpost, but a permanent settlement. They bring tools, seeds, livestock, household goods, everything needed to build English lives in an un-English land. England in the 1580s was a nation on the rise, but also a nation anxious about its place in the world. Queen Elizabeth I had ruled for over 25 years, bringing relative stability after the religious turmoil of previous reigns. England was Protestant, having broken with Rome under Elizabeth's father Henry VIII. and this religious divide defined much of England's relationship with the rest of Europe. The great power of the age was Spain. Spanish conquistadors had conquered vast empires in Mexico and Peru, bringing unimaginable wealth in gold and silver back to Spain. Spanish treasure fleets sailed regularly from the New World to Spain, carrying the wealth that made Spain the most powerful nation on earth. Spanish colonies dotted the Americas from Florida to Tierra del Fuego. Spain claimed most of the Western Hemisphere as its own, granted by papal decree, and jealously guarded this monopoly. England, by contrast, had no American colonies. English ships had sailed to North America. John Cabot had explored the coast as early as 1497, but no permanent English settlements existed. England's attempts at expansion had focused on Ireland, where English Protestant settlers were being planted on lands taken from the Irish Catholics, a brutal process of colonization that would leave wounds lasting centuries. But by the 1580s, a growing faction in England argued that the nation needed American colonies to compete with Spain. The arguments were both economic and strategic. American colonies could provide raw materials. England needed timber for shipbuilding, fish from the rich coastal waters, furs, minerals, perhaps even gold. They could serve as bases for English privateers, essentially licensed pirates to raid Spanish shipping. They could spread Protestant Christianity to the natives, countering Spanish Catholic influence. And they could serve as outlets for England's surplus population, which was growing rapidly and creating social tensions. The leading advocate for American colonization was Sir Walter Raleigh, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth. Raleigh was handsome, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced that England's future lay across the Atlantic. He obtained from the Queen a charter granting him the right to explore and colonize lands in North America not already claimed by Christian princes, which meant, in practice, lands not occupied by Spain. The charter was extraordinarily broad. Raleigh was granted ownership of any lands he discovered and settled, extending 200 leagues in every direction from the colony. He could establish governments, make laws, grant lands, mint coins essentially. He would be the absolute ruler of his American domain. In return, he would pay the crown 1/5 of any gold or silver he discovered, and would defend his colony against Spanish attack. Raleigh understood that establishing a successful colony would require significant resources and careful planning. He needed to know what he was colonizing, what the land was like, whether it could support English settlers, what peoples lived there, what resources existed. So in 1584, he organized a reconnaissance expedition, 2 ships commanded by Philip Amadus and Arthur Barlow, with Portuguese pilot Simon Fernandez navigating. The expedition left England in April 1584 and made landfall on the outer banks of present-day North Carolina in July. What the English found astonished them. The coastal region was beautiful, fertile, temperate, a landscape that seemed like paradise compared to England's cold, wet climate. The barrier islands were covered with dense forests of pine and cedar. Wild grapes grew in such profusion that waves washed up to them. The waters teemed with fish. Flocks of birds darkened the sky, and they met the natives. The first contact occurred when 2 of Barlow's men went hunting on the islands and encountered a group of Algonquian-speaking peoples. The natives were initially wary, but became friendly when the English offered trade goods. They invited the English to their village on Roanoke Island, inside the barrier islands. The English were fascinated by what they found. The natives lived in substantial villages with longhouses covered in bark and mats. They cultivated extensive gardens growing corn, beans, squash, and tobacco. They were skilled fishermen, using weirs and nets to harvest the abundant seafood. They wore clothing of deerskin and adorned themselves with shells, copper ornaments, and body paint. They seemed prosperous, healthy, and well-organized. The paramount chief of the region was named Wingina, who ruled from the mainland village of Dassamongepyuk. Wingina's people were part of a larger group the English called the CROATOAN, though this was probably not what they called themselves. The CROATOAN controlled much of the mainland coast, and the sounds the bodies of water between the barrier islands and the mainland. Also present in the region were the CROATOAN people, who lived on the southern part of the Outer Banks, particularly on what is now Hatteras Island. The CROATOAN were related to the CROATOAN but were a distinct group with their own chief and their own interests. They would play a crucial role in the story to come. Barlow's men spent several weeks exploring the region, learning what they could of the geography and the peoples. Two natives, Manteo and Wanchese, agreed to return to England with the expedition. Manteo was CROATOAN, son of a chief's sister, which in this matrilineal society gave him significant status. Wanchese was CROATOAN, from Wingina's territory. Both men were probably in their 20s or 30s, intelligent and curious about these strange, pale visitors who had arrived in their great ships. The expedition returned to England in September 1584 with Manteo and Wanchese aboard. The reports they brought were extraordinarily positive. Barlow's written account described the region in glowing terms, portraying it as an earthly paradise where English colonists could prosper. He described the natives as friendly and generous, eager to trade, living in abundance in a land of plenty. This report was exactly what Raleigh wanted to hear. He immediately began planning a larger expedition to establish a permanent colony. He named the region Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, a piece of flattery that pleased the Queen, and also gave the region a properly English name to replace the native names he could not pronounce. But Raleigh made a crucial decision. He would not go himself. Instead, he would send others to establish the colony, while he remained in England to manage the financial and political aspects of the venture. This decision meant the colony would lack his direct leadership, and also meant Raleigh's personal fortune would not be risked. He was investing heavily in the venture, but he was also hedging his bets. The man chosen to lead the first colonizing expedition was Sir Richard Grenville, Raleigh's cousin, a naval commander with a reputation for courage, but also for harshness and inflexibility. Under Grenville would serve Ralph Lane as governor of the colony once it was established. Lane was a military man, experienced in the brutal Irish wars, tough and capable, but also short-tempered and not particularly diplomatic. The expedition left Plymouth in April 1585 with 7 ships and about 600 men, far more than would stay at the colony, as most were sailors who would return to England once the colonists were landed. The actual colonists numbered about 108 men. Notably, this first expedition included no women or children. It was conceived as a military garrison and trading post rather than a true settlement. Also aboard was Thomas Harriot, a brilliant mathematician and scientist whom Raleigh had hired to document the expedition. Harriot would learn the Algonquian language from Manteo and Wanchese during the voyage, and would later write one of the most important early descriptions of the region and its peoples. Also present was John White, an artist who would create watercolor paintings of the natives, their villages, their customs, and the flora and fauna of the region. White's paintings survive and are remarkable historical documents, showing the world the English encountered with a level of detail and care unusual for the period. The voyage across the Atlantic took longer than expected due to poor weather and navigational errors. The fleet became separated, and it was not until late June that Grenville's flagship reached the Outer Banks. The crossing had been difficult, disease had broken out aboard ship, supplies had run low, tensions had risen. The colonists who finally landed on Roanoke Island were exhausted, depleted, and already quarrelling among themselves. Grenville's behaviour during the approach to the colony set an unfortunate tone. When he stopped at a native village for food and a silver cup went missing, Grenville ordered the entire village burned in retaliation. This act of disproportionate violence shocked even his own men and immediately poisoned relations with the natives. Word of the burning spread among the coastal peoples, and the English went from being exotic curiosities to being dangerous invaders, to be treated with caution and fear. The colonists began building their settlement on the north end of Roanoke Island in July 1585. They constructed a fort with earthen ramparts and a palisade of logs. Inside the fort, they built houses, a storehouse for supplies, and other necessary structures. The fort was positioned to defend against attack from the sea or from the mainland, though its location on the sound side of the island, rather than facing the Atlantic, would later prove problematic. Grenville left Lane in command of the colony and departed in late August, taking most of the ships and men with him. He promised to return by Easter 1586 with supplies and reinforcements. Lane was left with about 108 colonists, a fortified position, and supplies that were supposed to last until Grenville's return. What followed was a comedy of errors mixed with tragedy. Lane was not suited to govern a colony. He was paranoid, suspicious, and quick to see threats where none existed. His military background made him view everything through the lens of security and defense, rather than building relationships with the natives who surrounded the colony and upon whom the colonists depended for much of their food. Relations with the CROATOAN deteriorated rapidly. The English demanded food, offering trade goods in return, but the amount of food they demanded was far more than the natives could reasonably spare without starving themselves. The English did not understand or did not care that native agriculture operated on a subsistence basis with little surplus. Taking enough corn to feed over 100 Englishmen for months meant taking food from native families who would then go hungry. Moreover, the English were arrogant and disrespectful. They treated the natives as inferiors, made demands rather than requests, and resorted to threats when their demands were not met quickly enough. Lane became convinced that Wingina was plotting against the colony, though the evidence for this was thin. Wingina had legitimate grievances. The English had burned villages, stolen food, and generally behaved like hostile invaders rather than trading partners. Thomas Harriot and John White, to their credit, tried to build better relations. Harriot learned the language and spent time in native villages, observing their customs, asking questions, showing genuine interest and respect. White painted portraits of individual natives with care and artistry, capturing their dignity and humanity. But their efforts could not overcome Lane's military mindset and the structural problem that the colony needed more from the natives than the natives could afford to give. The promised supply ship from Grenville did not arrive at Easter. The colonists began to run short of food. Their own attempts at agriculture had failed. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, and even if they had planted, they lacked knowledge of how to cultivate corn and other crops suited to the region. English crops failed in the unfamiliar climate and soil. The colonists were dependent on fish, whatever wild food they could gather, and whatever they could obtain from the natives through trade or theft. By June 1586, the situation was desperate. Lane, convinced that Wingina was about to attack, decided to strike first. In a dawn raid, Lane and his men attacked Wingina's village, killed several natives, including Wingina himself, and displayed the chief's head on a pike as a warning. This act of violence confirmed what many natives had already concluded. The English were enemies to be driven away, not partners to be accommodated. Then, providentially for the colonists, Sir Francis Drake arrived. Drake, one of England's most famous privateers, had been raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and was returning to England via the North American coast. He stopped at Roanoke in June 1586, saw the colonists' desperate situation, and offered them passage home. Lane and all his colonists accepted. They abandoned the fort, took what they could carry, and sailed away with Drake, leaving Roanoke Island empty once again. The first English colony in America had lasted less than a year and had been an unmitigated disaster. It had accomplished nothing except poisoning relations with the natives, demonstrating English incompetence at self-sufficiency, and using up Raleigh's financial resources with no return. Any reasonable person would have concluded that Roanoke was a failure and that future colonial efforts should be directed elsewhere. But Raleigh was not ready to give up, and in Thomas Harriot's report and John White's paintings, he saw evidence that success was possible if the next colony was better planned and better led. The land was fertile. The natives were not innately hostile, they had been turned hostile by English arrogance and violence. A colony led by a governor who could build good relations, who brought women and families rather than just soldiers, who came prepared to be self-sufficient. Such a colony might succeed where Lanes had failed. And so, in the winter of 1586 to 1587, Raleigh began planning a second expedition. This time, it would be different. This time, they would not repeat Lane's mistakes. This time, they would establish not just a garrison but a true settlement, a city of Raleigh, that would be the foundation of permanent English presence in America. This time, the governor would be John White, the artist, a man who had shown respect for the natives, who had demonstrated good judgment and humanity during Lane's troubled governorship. White accepted the position, convinced he could succeed where Lane had failed. He began recruiting colonists, not soldiers, but families, men, women, and children, who would build lives in Virginia, who would farm and trade and raise English children on American soil. Among those who agreed to go was White's own pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. They would bring the next generation of the White family to Virginia, planting English roots in American soil. Their child, born in the New World, would be the first English subject born in America, a symbol of the future Raleigh envisioned. 115 colonists signed on for the venture. We know most of their names, preserved in the records that survive. They were not aristocrats, but common people, craftsmen, farmers, traders, families seeking opportunity. Among them were women and children, entire households transplanting themselves across an ocean to an uncertain future. They were the hopeful, the desperate, the adventurous, the foolish. In short, they were people. They left Plymouth in May 1587 in 3 ships under the command of Simon Fernandez, the same Portuguese pilot who had navigated the 1584 reconnaissance. Their destination was Chesapeake Bay, about 150 miles north of Roanoke. Raleigh had decided that Roanoke Island was unsuitable for the permanent settlement. The harbour was too shallow, the location too exposed, the memories of Lane's violence too fresh. The new colony would be established at Chesapeake Bay, where the harbour was better and relations with natives could begin fresh. But something went wrong. What exactly happened remains unclear, but the result was that the colonists were landed not at Chesapeake, but at Roanoke Island, the site of Lane's failed colony. Fernandez, it seems, refused to carry them further north. Perhaps he was eager to get to the Caribbean to raid Spanish shipping. Perhaps he feared that the season was too advanced and storms would trap them. Perhaps there was a dispute between Fernandez and White about payment or command authority. Whatever the reason, in late July 1587, the colonists found themselves being rowed ashore at Roanoke Island, the place they had specifically been told they would not settle, the place where the previous colony had failed so spectacularly. They had no choice but to make the best of it. They went ashore, carrying their belongings, looking at the ruins of Lane's fort, beginning the work of rebuilding and making this place, whether they wanted to or not, their new home. The colonists who landed on Roanoke Island in late July of 1587 found the fort that Lane's expedition had built still standing, though in poor condition. The palisade walls were intact but weathered. The houses inside the fort were roofless and damaged, their thatched roofs having rotted away or been destroyed by storms during the year the site had been abandoned. Vines and weeds had grown up through the floors. Animals had made nests in the corners, but the basic structures remained, and this gave the colonists a significant advantage. They had shelter that could be repaired rather than having to build from nothing. The location itself presented both advantages and challenges. Roanoke Island lies between the Outer Banks Barrier Islands and the mainland of North Carolina, in the waters of Pamlico Sound. It is roughly 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, covered mostly in dense maritime forest of pine, cedar, and oak. The soil is sandy, but fertile enough to support the native crops of corn, beans, and squash. Fresh water could be obtained from shallow wells or from rainfall collected in barrels. The site Lane had chosen for the fort was on the northern end of the island, facing the mainland about 6 miles away across the Sound. This gave some protection from Atlantic storms, which would hit the Outer Banks first, but it also meant the settlement was somewhat isolated from the ocean. Ships approaching had to navigate through inlets in the barrier islands, then sail up the Sound to reach the settlement, a tricky passage requiring local knowledge and good weather. The first weeks were focused on making the settlement habitable. The men, and likely many of the women, worked to repair the damaged houses, replacing rotten timbers, rethatching roofs with marsh grass and pine boughs, clearing vegetation from the fort interior. They reinforced the palisade walls, sharpening the tops of the stakes and adding additional stakes where gaps had appeared. They dug new wells and tested the water quality. They built privies outside the fort and established paths through the surrounding forest to fresh water sources and potential garden sites. Meanwhile, other colonists explored the island, mapping its extent, looking for good places to fish and hunt, identifying resources that would be useful. The island had abundant timber for building and fuel. The surrounding waters teemed with fish, mullet, drum, flounder, and countless other species. Shellfish could be gathered from the beaches. Deer lived in the forests, and the colonists who had brought muskets could hunt them, though powder and shot had to be conserved carefully. The relationship with the local natives was complicated from the start. The CROATOAN on the mainland remembered Lane's violence, the burned villages, the murdered chief Wingina. They were understandably wary of these new English arrivals. Were these the same English who had caused so much trouble? Or were they different people who might be dealt with differently? To the colonists' advantage, Manteo was with them. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had travelled to England twice now, spoke English fluently and understood both cultures. He had been baptized as a Christian and given the title Lord of Roanoke by Raleigh, a largely symbolic title but one that indicated English respect for him. Manteo was sympathetic to the English and genuinely seemed to want to help them succeed. He could translate, he could explain English intentions, he could mediate disputes. Through Manteo, White attempted to make contact with the mainland tribes and establish peaceful relations. He sent messages explaining that this was a new group of English, that they came in peace, that they wanted to trade fairly and live as neighbours. The response was cautious. Some natives agreed to meet with White, others refused, remembering what had happened under Lane's governorship. One early incident highlighted the tensions and the potential for misunderstanding. Shortly after the colonists landed, George Howe, one of the colonists, went alone to a creek to catch crabs. He was attacked by a group of natives and killed, his body pierced by 16 arrows. The colonists were shocked and frightened. Was this the beginning of a general assault? Would they all be killed as Lane had feared? White's investigation suggested the attack might have been a case of mistaken identity or revenge for Lane's actions, rather than the opening move of a coordinated campaign against the new colony. The attackers may have thought Howe was part of Lane's group, or they may have simply been taking revenge for previous English violence. White tried to re-establish contact with the tribes, sending messages of peace, but the damage had been done. The colonists were reminded that they were living surrounded by peoples who had reason to hate them, who could attack at any time, who knew the land far better than the colonists did. Despite this tension, life in the settlement began to establish a rhythm. The colonists organized themselves according to the plan White had developed. There was a council to assist the governor in making decisions. Each family was assigned a plot of land where they could build a house and cultivate a garden. Communal areas were designated for shared activities, cooking, worship, meetings. Work schedules were established so that essential tasks guarding the fort, fishing, hunting, gathering firewood were covered. The colonists had brought seeds from England, wheat, barley, peas, herbs. But it was late July, too late in the season to plant these English crops with any hope of harvest before winter. They would have to rely on fishing, hunting, and whatever they could obtain from the natives through trade. Next spring, they would plant properly, both English crops and native corn, and by next autumn, they would harvest enough food to be self-sufficient. That was the plan. They had also brought livestock, chickens, pigs, perhaps goats, though the records are unclear about exactly what animals came on the voyage. These animals needed to be penned and fed, another task in the endless list of things that had to be done to make the settlement viable. And there were the daily necessities of life: cooking meals, mending clothes, making and repairing tools, maintaining weapons, collecting fresh water, cutting firewood, washing, cleaning. The labor was endless, from sunrise to sunset and beyond. This was not the paradise Barlow had described, where grapes grew to the water's edge and fish jumped into boats. This was hard, grinding work in a hot, humid climate, plagued by mosquitoes and biting flies, surrounded by an unfamiliar landscape where every plant and animal was strange and potentially dangerous. But there were moments of hope and even joy. The forest was beautiful. The sunsets over the Sound were spectacular. The abundance of the natural world was genuinely impressive compared to crowded, depleted England. And in August of 1587, an event occurred that seemed to symbolize hope for the colony's future. Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, gave birth to a daughter on August 18th. The child was healthy, the delivery apparently uncomplicated. She was christened Virginia, named for the land where she was born, and she became the first English child born in the Americas. The christening was a ceremony of joy and hope, the colonists gathering to welcome this new life, this symbol of their future in this new world. Virginia Dare's birth was more than just a personal milestone for the Dare family. It was a statement of intent. This was not a temporary garrison of soldiers who would eventually return home. This was a true settlement where families would live, where children would be born and raised, where English roots would be planted in American soil. Virginia Dare was living proof that the colony could survive, could grow, could become permanent. But even as the colonists celebrated, they were aware of a growing problem: supplies. The food they had brought from England was running low. The fishing was good, but not abundant enough to feed over 100 people indefinitely. Hunting was yielding some game, but the colonists were not skilled woodsmen and could not match the natives' ability to track and kill deer. Trade with the natives was sporadic and insufficient. By late August, it was clear that unless a supply ship arrived soon, the colony would face serious food shortages before winter. The colonists held a meeting to discuss the situation. The conclusion was unavoidable. Someone needed to return to England to obtain supplies and reinforcements. The colony could not wait until Raleigh sent a ship on his own schedule. By the time such a ship arrived, it might be too late. Someone from the colony needed to go immediately, to explain the situation to Raleigh, to plead for quick assistance. The obvious choice was John White himself. As governor, he had the authority to speak for the colony. He knew Raleigh personally and could make a direct appeal. He understood what supplies were needed and could ensure the supply ship brought the right materials. But White resisted this idea. Leaving meant abandoning his daughter and infant granddaughter. It meant leaving the colonists leaderless during the critical first winter. It meant crossing the Atlantic twice to England and back a dangerous journey in the best of circumstances. And it meant trusting Fernandez or another pilot to actually return to Roanoke, not leave the colonists stranded as Fernandez had arguably already done by refusing to take them to Chesapeake Bay as planned. The colonists, however, were insistent. White was the only person with the standing to ensure quick action from Raleigh. Other colonists could not speak with the same authority, and if White stayed, they argued, he would just watch his family and friends starve. Better that he go, secure supplies, and return to save them all. Finally, reluctantly, White agreed. But he insisted on certain conditions. The colonists must promise that if they decided to leave Roanoke Island, if the situation became untenable, if they needed to move to a better location, they would leave a message indicating where they had gone. They should carve the name of their destination on a tree or post in a prominent location. And if they were leaving because of danger or attack, they should carve a Maltese cross above the message to indicate distress. The colonists agreed to this plan. White made arrangements to sail with Fernandez, who was planning to leave soon to catch the favourable winds for the return journey to England. White packed quickly, said emotional farewells to Eleanor and to baby Virginia, embraced his son-in-law Ananias, and gave final instructions to the assistant governors who would lead in his absence. On August 27, 1587, 9 days after Virginia Dare's birth, John White boarded Fernandez's ship and sailed away from Roanoke Island. As the settlement disappeared behind him, White must have felt torn between hope and dread. He was going to get help, to save the colony, but he was also leaving his family behind in a precarious situation, surrounded by hostile natives, short of food, facing a winter in an unfamiliar land. He promised himself he would return quickly by spring at the latest. A few months, and he would be back with supplies, and the colony would be saved. He had no way of knowing that he would never see his daughter or granddaughter again, that 3 years would pass before he could return, that when he finally did return he would find the settlement abandoned and everyone gone. As his ship sailed east, John White was still hopeful, still confident that his colony would succeed. He did not know he was leaving them to their fate, that his departure marked the beginning of the end of the Roanoke colony, that he was sailing into history as the governor who left his colonists to vanish into the American wilderness. Behind him, on Roanoke Island, the colonists watched the ship until it disappeared over the horizon. Then they turned back to their settlement, to the work that needed to be done, to preparing for winter, to building the city of Raleigh that would be their new home. They expected White to return in a few months. They had no reason to think otherwise. They could not know that they were already becoming ghosts, that within 3 years they would all be gone, that their settlement would be empty, that only a single word carved into a post would remain to mark their existence. The sun set over Pamlico Sound, the cooking fires were lit, the guards took their positions on the palisade walls, and life in the settlement continued, ordinary and everyday, for people who were already becoming legend. The voyage back to England should have been routine. Simon Fernandez was an experienced pilot who had made the Atlantic crossing multiple times. The route was well known by 1587's sail northeast, to catch the westerly winds that would carry the ship across to Europe, then turn south to reach England. In good weather, the crossing could take as little as 3 or 4 weeks. But this was not a good crossing. The ship encountered storms almost immediately after leaving the American coast. The fall season was notorious for hurricanes that formed in the Caribbean and swept north along the Atlantic coast. Fernandez's ship was caught in the edges of such a storm system, buffeted by high winds and heavy seas that sent waves crashing over the deck and required the crew to work around the clock just to keep the ship afloat. The ship was driven north and east, off course, forced to ride out the storms rather than maintain a steady heading. Food ran short, as the voyage was taking far longer than planned. Fresh water, stored in wooden casks, developed a foul taste and began to run low. Several crew members fell ill with dysentery or scurvy. One man died and was buried at sea. White, not a sailor, could do little except stay out of the way and endure. He spent the voyage in his tiny cabin, cramped and miserable, suffering from seasickness, worrying about his family back at Roanoke, wondering if this voyage would ever end. His journal entries from the crossing are brief and focused on the hardships, the storms, the sickness, the delays. Finally, in late October 1587, after nearly 2 months at sea, Fernandez's ship reached the coast of Ireland. They were far north of their intended destination, blown off course by the storms. They limped into an Irish port to take on water and make repairs, then sailed south around the Irish coast and across the Irish Sea to England, finally reaching Southampton in early November. White immediately sent word to Walter Raleigh in London, explaining the colony's situation and pleading for a relief expedition to be organized immediately. Then he travelled to London himself to make his case in person. But White's timing could not have been worse. England in November of 1587 was a nation preparing for war. Relations with Spain, always tense, had deteriorated to the breaking point. King Philip II of Spain, frustrated by English privateering raids on Spanish shipping, by English support for Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule in the Netherlands, and by Elizabeth's execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, had decided to invade England. Philip was assembling an enormous fleet, the Spanish Armada, to carry an invasion force across the Channel. The plan was for the Armada to sail from Spain to the Netherlands, pick up Spanish troops stationed there, and land them in England. With Spanish military might and English Catholic support, Philip believed he could overthrow Elizabeth and return England to Catholicism. Word of the Armada's preparation had reached England, and the country was mobilizing for defense. Every ship that could fight was being commandeered or hired by the Crown. Naval stores were being collected, troops were being raised, coastal defenses were being strengthened. The entire nation was focused on the coming conflict. In this environment, Walter Raleigh's colonial venture received little attention. Raleigh himself had more pressing concerns than a colony of 115 people on a distant island. He was organizing privateering expeditions against Spanish shipping. He was serving on the council, advising Elizabeth on defense measures. He was investing in ships that would fight in the coming battle. The Roanoke colony, which should have been his pride and joy, became instead a distraction, a minor concern that would have to wait until the Spanish threat was dealt with. White pleaded with Raleigh to send a relief expedition regardless. The colonists were running out of food. Winter was approaching. They had been told supplies would come quickly. Abandoning them would be both cruel and wasteful if they starved or were killed. All the investment in the colony would be lost. Surely one or two small ships could be spared to carry supplies to Roanoke without compromising England's defence. Raleigh was sympathetic but unmoved. Every ship was needed. The privateering ventures he was organising would strike at Spanish shipping and funding, weakening Spain's ability to sustain the Armada. He could not spare ships for a voyage that would take months and bring no immediate return. White would have to wait until the Spanish crisis was resolved. Then, Raleigh promised, relief would be sent. White was devastated but had no choice except to accept Raleigh's decision. He spent the winter of 1587 to 1588 in London and at Raleigh's estates, trying to maintain hope, writing letters, making plans for the relief voyage that would come in the spring. He commissioned supplies to be assembled: food, tools, seeds, cloth, weapons, powder, and shot. He recruited additional colonists to reinforce the settlement. He arranged for ships to be chartered as soon as they became available. But spring came, and the ships were still not available. The Armada was approaching, expected to arrive in English waters by midsummer. Elizabeth issued orders that no ship could leave England without express royal permission. White's supply voyage was indefinitely postponed. In desperation, White convinced Raleigh to let him hire two small ships, tiny vessels that would not be useful in fighting the Armada, but could make the voyage to Roanoke. In late April 1588, White sailed from England with these two small ships, a skeleton crew, and whatever supplies he could scrape together. It was not the substantial relief expedition he had hoped for, but it was something. He would reach Roanoke, deliver what supplies he had, perhaps bring some colonists back if they wanted to return, and then organize a proper relief expedition once the Spanish crisis had passed. But this voyage was doomed from the start. The ships White had hired were not primarily interested in delivering supplies to Roanoke. Their captains were privateers who saw the voyage as an opportunity to raid Spanish or French shipping. White's needs were secondary to their desire for plunder. Almost immediately after leaving England, the ships encountered a French fleet. The privateer captains decided to attack, hoping to capture valuable prizes. A naval engagement followed. The English ships were badly outgunned. One ship was severely damaged and had to limp back to England. White's ship was also damaged and lost many crew members killed or wounded in the fighting. White pleaded with the captain to continue to Roanoke. They were already at sea. They were partway across the Atlantic. Surely they could complete the voyage. But the captain refused. The ship was too damaged, the crew too depleted. They would return to England to make repairs. And so, in May of 1588, less than a month after leaving England, White was back where he started, having achieved nothing except demonstrating the difficulty of reaching Roanoke during a time of war. His supplies were still in England, his colonists were still stranded, and the Spanish Armada was approaching England's shores. The summer of 1588 was one of the most dramatic in English history. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying over 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel in late July. The English fleet, commanded by Sir Francis Drake, Lord Howard of Effingham, and other experienced captains, harried the Spanish ships, using their superior maneuverability and long-range guns to inflict damage while avoiding close combat, where Spanish numbers would have been decisive. The climax came on July 29th at the Battle of Gravelines, where English fire ships, old vessels loaded with gunpowder and set aflame, were sent into the anchored Spanish fleet, causing panic and scattering the ships. The English fleet then attacked the disorganized Spanish, inflicting heavy damage. The Armada was forced to flee north around Scotland and Ireland, attempting to return to Spain by sailing around the British Isles. The voyage home was catastrophic for the Spanish. Storms wrecked dozens of ships on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers drowned or died of starvation and exposure. Of the 130 ships that left Spain, fewer than 70 returned. It was one of the greatest naval disasters in history. England erupted in celebration. The Spanish threat was defeated. Elizabeth's reign was secure. The nation had been tested and had triumphed. Medals were struck, commemorating the victory with the motto, "God blew and they were scattered," crediting divine intervention with the storms that finished off the fleeing Armada. But for John White, the defeat of the Armada meant only that perhaps now, finally, ships would be available for the relief expedition to Roanoke. He renewed his appeals to Raleigh. The crisis was over. England was safe. Now they could send help to the abandoned colonists. But Raleigh's attention was elsewhere. The defeat of the Armada had not ended the war with Spain, it had merely prevented an invasion. English privateers continued to raid Spanish shipping and colonies. Raleigh was organising and funding these expeditions, which brought him considerable profit. The Roanoke colony, which had so far brought no profit whatsoever, was a low priority. Moreover, Raleigh was beginning to lose faith in the Roanoke venture. The first colony under Lane had failed. The second colony was now cut off, and quite possibly dead. Perhaps Roanoke was simply not a viable location for a colony. Perhaps future efforts should focus elsewhere, the Chesapeake Bay region that had been the original destination, or further south near Spanish Florida where the climate was more favorable, or even in the Caribbean where English privateers had captured strategic islands. White continued to press for a relief voyage, but it was not until March of 1589 that he was able to convince Raleigh to provide funds and authorization. Even then, the voyage was conceived primarily as a privateering expedition that would stop at Roanoke on the way to the Caribbean. White would be a passenger, not the commander, and the needs of the colony would be secondary to the profit-seeking goals of the privateers. This expedition never reached Roanoke at all. The ships sailed from England in March 1589, but were diverted to the Azores to intercept Spanish treasure ships. Then they sailed to the Caribbean to raid Spanish settlements. By the time they could have reached Roanoke, the hurricane season was approaching, and the captains decided it was too dangerous to attempt the tricky navigation through the inlets to reach the colony. The ships returned to England in the autumn of 1589, and White had not even caught a glimpse of the North American coast. 2 years had now passed since White left Roanoke. 2 years during which the colonists had received no supplies, no reinforcements, no word from England. White was increasingly desperate, increasingly angry at Raleigh and the privateer captains who valued profit over the lives of the colonists. He wrote bitter letters, accusing Raleigh of abandoning the colony, demanding that something be done immediately. Raleigh, stung by the criticism, finally agreed to organize a proper relief expedition for the spring of 1590. But by then, other pressures were mounting. Raleigh's finances were strained by the expenses of his various ventures. His political position at court was less secure than it had been. Other favourites were competing for Elizabeth's attention and patronage, and his interest in American colonization was waning. He was increasingly focused on other projects, particularly in Ireland, where he was establishing estates on confiscated Irish lands. The spring of 1590 came and went with no expedition. White continued to wait, increasingly desperate, increasingly certain that his family was dead, yet clinging to hope that somehow they had survived. Finally, in March of 1590, an expedition was assembled. 3 ships would sail to the West Indies to conduct privateering raids, and then, on the return voyage, would stop at Roanoke to check on the colony. White boarded one of the ships, probably feeling that this would be his last chance. He was now approaching 60 years old, worn down by 3 years of frustration and worry. This voyage had to succeed. He had to reach Roanoke. He had to know what had happened to his family. The ships left Plymouth on March 20th, 1590. The voyage to the Caribbean proceeded as planned. The privateers raided Spanish settlements, captured prizes, and made their profits. By August, they were ready to turn north toward the Outer Banks and finally, check on the Roanoke colony. White's journal entries from this period reflect his rising anxiety. Each day of the voyage north was a day closer to learning his family's fate. Were they alive? Had they managed to survive 3 years without supplies? Or would he find graves, or worse, no trace at all of what had happened? On August 15th, 1590, 3 years almost to the day after White had left Roanoke, the ships approached the Outer Banks. They were looking for the inlet that would allow them to enter the Sound and reach Roanoke Island. The coast had changed in 3 years. Storms had shifted the sandbars, altered the channels. The pilots had difficulty identifying the correct inlet. Finally, they found an opening and attempted to navigate through. 2 boats were launched to row ahead and check the depth. One boat capsized in the surf, drowning 7 men, including Captain Edward Spicer. White, watching from the ship, saw his companions disappear beneath the waves, a terrible omen of what was to come, but they persisted. The remaining boat found a navigable channel, and the ships carefully made their way through the inlet into the Sound. They sailed north toward Roanoke Island. White stood at the ship's rail, scanning the shore, looking for signs of the settlement, for smoke from cooking fires, for movement, for any indication that the colonists were still there. As they approached the north end of the island where the settlement should be, White saw smoke rising from the forest. His heart leaped. Smoke meant fires. Fires meant people. The colonists were alive. The ships anchored offshore. It was late afternoon on August 16th, too late to land safely, so they would wait until morning. But White could not contain his impatience. That night, as darkness fell, he had his ship's trumpeter play English tunes, hoping the colonists would hear familiar music and know that rescue had arrived. They lit torches and held them up, signalling their presence. They called out across the water. No response came from the island. The forest was dark and silent. The smoke they had seen earlier was no longer visible. White told himself the colonists were probably asleep, or perhaps they were being cautious, not wanting to reveal themselves until they were sure the ship was friendly. In the morning, all would be explained. White barely slept that night. He was going to see Eleanor tomorrow. He was going to meet his granddaughter, Virginia, who would now be 3 years old. He was going to deliver the supplies, hear the colonists' stories of survival, and begin the work of strengthening the settlement. The long nightmare of separation was almost over. Morning came, August 17th, 1590. White was rowed ashore with a party of men, landing on the beach at the north end of the island. They climbed the sandy path through the dunes toward where the settlement should be, calling out, announcing their arrival. The forest was silent. No one came to greet them. White felt the first stirrings of real fear. Where was everyone? They continued inland, following paths they remembered from 3 years before, though the forest had reclaimed some of them. Then, through the trees, White saw the palisade wall of the fort. It was still standing, but something was wrong. The gate stood open. No smoke rose from within. No voices called out. No activity was visible. White hurried forward, his men following. They passed through the gate and into the fort. It was empty. The houses stood silent, doors hanging open. Grass and weeds grew in the paths. Vines climbed the walls. The place had the feeling of abandonment, of a settlement that had been empty not for days but for months or even years. White ran from house to house, calling his daughter's name, calling for anyone, searching for some sign of life. He found nothing. The houses were empty of people and mostly empty of possessions. The colonists had taken their belongings with them when they left. This was not a settlement destroyed by attack. This was a settlement deliberately abandoned, the inhabitants packing up and leaving. But where had they gone? White's men spread out, searching the entire fort compound systematically. Near the entrance, one of them called out. White ran to see what had been found. On the right-hand side of the entrance, carved into a post at eye level, were 3 letters. CRO. White's heart pounded. This was the signal they had agreed upon. If the colonists left, they would carve their destination. CRO was the beginning of something. The beginning of CROATOAN. They searched further. On the palisade wall itself, carved more clearly and completely, was a word, CROATOAN. White stared at the carving. CROATOAN. The name of an island to the south, modern-day Hatteras Island. The home of Mantio's people, the friendly CROATOAN tribe who had always been sympathetic to the English. The colonists had gone to CROATOAN, but there was no Maltese cross. White had specifically instructed the colonists to carve a cross above any message if they were leaving under threat or distress. The absence of the cross meant they were not in immediate danger when they left. They had gone to CROATOAN voluntarily, perhaps seeking the protection and assistance of Mantio's people. White felt a surge of hope. They were alive. They had gone somewhere safe. All he had to do was sail to CROATOAN, and he would find them. He searched the rest of the settlement, looking for more clues. Near the shore, he found 5 heavy chests buried in a shallow pit, apparently hidden for safekeeping. The chests had been dug up by animals or by natives searching for valuables, and their contents scattered. White recognized some of the items as his own possessions that he had left behind. Maps, books, some of his paintings. They were damaged by weather and dirt, the papers rotting, the paintings ruined. He gathered what he could save and brought them back to the ship. But the important discovery was the word CROATOAN. That was where his daughter was. That was where 3-year-old Virginia Dare was, 50 miles south, on an island where friendly natives lived, where Mantio's family would have welcomed the colonists, where they would be safe. White returned to the ships and explained what he had found to the captains. They needed to sail south to CROATOAN immediately. The colonists were there, waiting to be found, but the captains were reluctant. The weather was deteriorating. A storm was approaching from the south. They could see the dark clouds building on the horizon. The ships were low on supplies after months in the Caribbean. The water casks were nearly empty. The anchors were dragging in the rising wind, threatening to drive the ships onto the shoals. White pleaded with them. CROATOAN was only 50 miles away. They could reach it in a day's sail, just a few more hours, and he would be reunited with his family. The captains discussed the situation. They decided to try. They would attempt to reach CROATOAN. The ships weighed anchor, and began to sail south. But the storm hit before they had gone far. The wind rose to gale force, driving massive waves before it. The ships were in danger of being wrecked on the shoals of the Outer Banks. Sailing was impossible. They had to reach open ocean to ride out the storm. The captains ordered the ships to turn east, heading out to sea, away from the dangerous coast. White stood at the rail, watching Roanoke Island and CROATOAN beyond it disappear behind him. He was being driven away from his family again, this time when he was so close, when he knew where they were, when rescue was just a day's sail away. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally passed, the ships were far out in the Atlantic, blown east and north by the winds. The captains assessed their situation. Fresh water was critically low. Food supplies were depleted. The ships had taken damage in the storm that needed repair. They could not continue to cruise the American coast looking for the colonists. They needed to return to England or risk losing the ships and all their crews. White begged them to try again to reach CROATOAN, but the captains were firm. The season was too advanced. Hurricane season was upon them. The ships were in no condition to attempt the difficult navigation required. They would return to England. White could organize another expedition and come back next year. White had no authority to overrule them. These were not his ships. He was merely a passenger. He had to accept their decision. On August 19th, 1590, just 2 days after landing at Roanoke, 3 years and 8 days after he had left his daughter there, John White sailed away from the North Carolina coast for the last time. He had been so close. 50 miles, 1 day's sail, and he had been forced to turn back. He promised himself he would return. As soon as the ships reached England, he would organize another expedition. He knew where the colonists were now, CROATOAN. He just needed to get back there, but he would never return. The ships reached England in late October 1590. White was now 60 years old, exhausted, nearly broken by disappointment. He continued to plead with Raleigh for another expedition, but Raleigh's interest in Roanoke had evaporated. The cost of the various failed attempts to relieve the colony had been enormous. The return on investment had been zero. Raleigh was done with Roanoke. White spent his last years in Ireland, on one of Raleigh's estates, where he had been granted a small property. He wrote a few letters, still pleading for someone to mount a rescue, but his letters went unanswered or received only polite dismissals. He died around 1593, cause unknown, his body buried in some unmarked grave in Ireland. He never learned what happened to his family. He never knew if they were alive or dead, if they had prospered with the CROATOAN or perished from disease or hardship. The word CROATOAN carved on that post was the last message he ever received from them, and it was a message he could never follow to its conclusion. His journal, in which he recorded the finding of the empty settlement and the carved word, survives. It is one of the primary sources for the lost colony story. Reading it, one can feel White's anguish, his desperate hope when he saw the smoke, his growing dread as he searched the empty fort, his relief when he found the word that told him where they had gone, and his ultimate despair when he was forced to sail away without reaching them. John White was a man who lost everything: his daughter, his granddaughter, the colonists he had pledged to protect, his life's work, his hope for the future. He stands in history as a tragic figure, a governor who left his colony to seek help and returned too late, a grandfather who never met his grandchild, an artist whose final paintings were of empty houses and mysterious carvings. And behind him, on CROATOAN Island or somewhere in the forests of the Carolina coast, 115 colonists continued their lives, unaware that no one was coming to rescue them, that England had forgotten them, that they would have to make their own way in this new world without help from the old. We must consider a perspective often missing. What did the native peoples think about these English arrivals? Imagine the CROATOAN people. Picture them the tribe most likely to have absorbed the colonists. They lived on what's now Hatteras Island, had met the English before, developed trading relationships. Their leader, Manteo, had even travelled to England, learned the language, and returned as interpreter. To the CROATOAN, these starving English refugees might have seemed both pathetic and potentially useful. They had metal tools, knowledge of European trade goods, skills that could help in future dealings. Integration wouldn't mean equality. The English would occupy subordinate positions initially, but it would mean survival. From the native perspective, the lost colony wasn't lost, it was absorbed. The English didn't vanish mysteriously. They did what desperate people do, accepted help from those willing to provide it, even if it meant abandoning English identity. This isn't the romantic mystery we prefer. It's a story of adaptation and survival, of people choosing life over pride. The colonists weren't lost. They were found by native peoples who offered survival on native terms. The obvious choice was John White himself. As governor, he had the authority to speak for the colony. He knew Raleigh personally and could make a direct appeal. He understood what supplies were needed and could ensure the supply ship brought the right materials. But White resisted this idea. Leaving meant abandoning his daughter and infant granddaughter. It meant leaving the colonists leaderless during the critical first winter. It meant crossing the Atlantic twice to England and back, a dangerous journey in the best of circumstances. And it meant trusting Fernandez or another pilot to actually return to Roanoke, not leave the colonists stranded as Fernandez had arguably already done, by refusing to take them to Chesapeake Bay as planned. The colonists, however, were insistent. White was the only person with the standing to ensure quick action from Raleigh. Other colonists could not speak with the same authority, and if White stayed, they argued, he would just watch his family and friends starve. Better that he go, secure supplies, and return to save them all. Finally, reluctantly, White agreed, but he insisted on certain conditions. The colonists must promise that if they decided to leave Roanoke Island, if the situation became untenable, if they needed to move to a better location, they would leave a message indicating where they had gone. They should carve the name of their destination on a tree or post in a prominent location. And if they were leaving because of danger or attack, they should carve a Maltese cross above the message to indicate distress. The colonists agreed to this plan. White made arrangements to sail with Fernandez, who was planning to leave soon to catch the favourable winds for the return journey to England. White packed quickly, said emotional farewells to Eleanor and to baby Virginia, embraced his son-in-law Ananias, and gave final instructions to the assistant governors who would lead in his absence. On August 27th, 1587, 9 days after Virginia Dare's birth, John White boarded Fernandez's ship and sailed away from Roanoke Island. As the settlement disappeared behind him, White must have felt torn between hope and dread. He was going to get help to save the colony, but he was also leaving his family behind in a precarious situation, surrounded by hostile natives, short of food, facing a winter in an unfamiliar land. He promised himself he would return quickly by spring at the latest. A few months, and he would be back with supplies, and the colony would be saved. He had no way of knowing that he would never see his daughter or granddaughter again, that 3 years would pass before he could return, that when he finally did return, he would find the settlement abandoned and everyone gone. As his ship sailed east, John White was still hopeful, still confident that his colony would succeed. He did not know he was leaving them to their fate, that his departure marked the beginning of the end of the Roanoke colony, that he was sailing into history as the governor who left his colonists to vanish into the American wilderness. Behind him on Roanoke Island, the colonists watched the ship until it disappeared over the horizon. Then they turned back to their settlement, to the work that needed to be done, to preparing for winter, to building the city of Raleigh that would be their new home. They expected White to return in a few months. They had no reason to think otherwise. They could not know that they were already becoming ghosts, that within 3 years they would all be gone, that their settlement would be empty, that only a single word carved into a post would remain to mark their existence. The sun set over Pamlico Sound. The cooking fires were lit. The guards took their positions on the palisade walls, and life in the settlement continued, ordinary and everyday, for people who were already becoming legend. What happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke? This question has obsessed historians, archaeologists, and amateur sleuths for over 4 centuries. The lack of definitive answer is both frustrating and fascinating. We have clues: the word CROATOAN, the empty settlement, later reports of Europeans living among native tribes, but no smoking gun, no bodies, no written account from the colonists themselves explaining their fate. Let us examine the major theories, weighing the evidence for and against each, attempting to understand what most likely happened to these vanished people. Theory 1. Integration with the CROATOAN tribe. This is the theory supported by the most evidence and considered most likely by most serious historians. It proposes that the colonists, facing starvation or danger, or simply recognizing the impossibility of surviving alone on Roanoke Island, moved to CROATOAN Island to live under the protection of Mantio's people. The evidence supporting this theory: the CROATOAN carving. This is the most direct evidence. The colonists left a message indicating where they had gone. CROATOAN Island, modern Hatteras Island, lies about 50 miles south of Roanoke, accessible by boat. The CROATOAN people who lived there had been consistently friendly to the English since the first contact in 1584. Mantio, their chief's nephew, had travelled to England twice, spoke English fluently, had been baptized Christian, and was part of the colony. If the colonists needed help, CROATOAN was the obvious place to go. The absence of a cross. White and the colonists had agreed that any message about leaving would be accompanied by a Maltese cross if the departure was due to distress or danger. No cross was carved above CROATOAN. This suggests the colonists left voluntarily, making their own decision to relocate rather than fleeing from attack. Archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island. Modern archaeological work on Hatteras Island, particularly excavations conducted since 2000, has uncovered numerous English artifacts dating to the 1580s and 1590s at native village sites. These include sword hilts, gun parts, copper ingots, a valuable trade good the colonists brought, and a gold signet ring that may have belonged to one of the colonists. The mixture of English items with native artifacts suggests cohabitation or trade relationships during the period when the lost colonists would have been in the area. English artifacts in native copperworking. Archaeologists have found evidence that natives in the CROATOAN region were reworking English copper objects, melting down copper ingots and kettles to create native-style ornaments. This suggests sustained contact and cultural exchange, not just brief trade encounters. Later reports of white natives. In the early 1600s, when Jamestown colonists began exploring the region, they heard numerous reports from natives about people with European features living in tribal communities. Captain John Smith, who explored the Chesapeake region extensively, recorded native accounts of people who wore European-style clothes and lived in houses with stone walls. These reports were frustratingly vague. Smith never met these alleged Europeans himself, only heard second-hand accounts, but they suggest some lost colonists or their descendants were still alive as late as 1607, 20 years after the colony was established. DNA evidence. Modern DNA studies of people from Hatteras Island and surrounding regions have found some individuals with unusual genetic markers consistent with European ancestry, dating to the late 16th century. However, this evidence must be treated cautiously. Europeans visited the region multiple times. Shipwrecks deposited European sailors on the coast, and later colonization efforts brought many Europeans to the area. Proving specific genetic links to the lost colonists is extraordinarily difficult. The Lumbee connection. The Lumbee people, a Native American tribe in North Carolina, have long maintained oral traditions that they are descended from the lost colonists who integrated with local tribes. Some Lumbee family names Dare, Cooper, Berry, and others match names from the colonist roster. Some early European observers noted that certain Lumbee individuals had grey or blue eyes, unusual in native populations. However, the Lumbee lived inland, west of Roanoke and Croatoan, so if the connection is real, it would require the colonists to have moved from Croatoan to the mainland and travelled inland, a secondary migration that complicates the story. Cultural logic. From the colonists' perspective, integration made sense. They were outnumbered, isolated, short of supplies, and surrounded by peoples who knew the land far better than they did. The Croatoan were friendly and had family connections through Manteo. Joining them would provide protection, food security, local knowledge, and community. For the Croatoan, accepting the English would bring access to metal tools, guns, and other valuable trade goods. Both groups had reasons to cooperate. Historical parallels. We know from other colonial encounters that Europeans who found themselves isolated often integrated with native populations. In the Spanish colonies, countless Spaniards married native women and created mestizo populations. In Canada, French fur traders frequently lived with native tribes and married into them. The rigid racial boundaries that would characterize later American history had not yet fully formed in the 1580s. Integration was not unthinkable, it was pragmatic survival. Against this theory, skeptics note that we have no definitive proof, no letter from a colonist saying, "We are living with the Croatoan," no mixed ancestry child, whose parentage can be definitively traced to the lost colonists. The archaeological evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. English artifacts on Croatoan could have arrived through trade rather than through colonists living there. The DNA evidence is contaminated by later European presence in the region. Moreover, if the colonists did integrate with the Croatoan, why did Croatoan people not tell later English visitors explicitly what had happened? When John Smith explored the region in the early 1600s, Croatoan descendants should have been alive who remembered the English colonists joining their tribe. Yet Smith's records mention only vague reports, nothing specific. This silence is puzzling. One possible explanation is that by the time Smith arrived, relationships between English and natives had deteriorated so badly due to violence at Jamestown and elsewhere that even tribes who had helped earlier colonists were no longer willing to admit to friendly relations with the English. Revealing that they had harboured English colonists might invite attack from hostile English colonists or rival native tribes. Despite these uncertainties, the integration theory remains the most evidence-based explanation. The colonists went to Croatoan, they said so themselves in the carving. What happened after that is less clear, but gradual integration over years or decades, with colonists and natives living together, intermarrying, and eventually blending into a single community, fits the available evidence better than any alternative. Theory 2. Massacre by hostile tribes. This theory proposes that the colonists were killed by hostile Native American tribes, either on Roanoke Island itself or after relocating elsewhere. The motive would be revenge for English violence under Ralph Lane's governorship, or simply the desire to eliminate foreign invaders. Evidence that might support this theory. George Howe's death. The killing of George Howe shortly after the colonists landed demonstrated that at least some natives were willing to attack English settlers. This violence could have escalated after White left. The Spanish Report. In 1588, Spanish records mention that the Spanish crown learned of an English settlement in Virginia and dispatched a reconnaissance mission to find and destroy it. The Spanish considered English presence in the region a threat to their Florida colonies and would have wanted to eliminate it. Spanish accounts claim they searched for the colony but could not locate it. However, some researchers have speculated that the Spanish did find and attack the colony, killing or capturing the colonists, but concealed this success in their records to avoid international complications. This theory is highly speculative and lacks supporting evidence. Later native accounts. Some early 17th century sources record native stories about a fight between different tribal groups in which Europeans were killed. However, these accounts are vague, possibly refer to different events entirely, and cannot be definitively linked to the lost colonists. The absence of evidence. If the colonists integrated with natives, we might expect to find more evidence, more artifacts, more references in later accounts, more genetic markers. The relative lack of such evidence might suggest the colonists did not survive long enough to leave much trace. Against this theory, the CROATOAN carving with no cross. If the colonists were under attack, they would have carved the Maltese cross to signal distress. They did not. This strongly suggests they were not fleeing from immediate danger when they left Roanoke. No bodies. If the colonists were massacred on Roanoke Island, or shortly after leaving, where are the bodies? Mass graves would leave archaeological evidence. Bodies left unburied would have left skeletal remains. The complete absence of human remains is difficult to explain if there was a massacre. No boasting. Native oral traditions often preserved stories of military victories. If a tribe had wiped out over 100 English invaders, this would have been a significant victory worth commemorating. Yet no native oral tradition claims credit for destroying the lost colony. The archaeological evidence at CROATOAN. The presence of English artifacts at CROATOAN native sites suggests the colonists did reach CROATOAN and lived there at least temporarily. If they were massacred before reaching CROATOAN, how did their possessions get there? Jamestown precedents. When Jamestown colonists were killed by hostile natives in attacks during the early 1600s, the natives made no secret of it. Bodies were left where they fell or displayed as warnings. The idea that a massacre of the lost colonists would be completely concealed, with no bodies and no native accounts, seems implausible. The massacre theory cannot be completely ruled out, but it requires us to ignore or explain away the most direct evidence we have: the colonists' own message that they were going to CROATOAN, carved without a distress signal. While individual colonists may have been killed in conflicts with natives over the years, a mass massacre of the entire colony seems unlikely given the evidence. Theory 3. Death by starvation and disease. This theory proposes that the colonists attempted to survive on their own, but gradually succumbed to malnutrition, disease, and the harsh conditions, with no dramatic massacre or integration, but simply slow attrition until none remained. Evidence that might support this theory. The food situation. The colonists arrived too late in the season to plant crops. They left England with limited supplies. John White's departure took away supplies that were meant for the colony. Fish and game could provide some food, but feeding over 100 people solely through hunting and fishing would be extremely difficult, especially for colonists unskilled in these activities. European vulnerability to disease. Europeans in the Americas often died in large numbers from diseases typhoid, dysentery, malaria, and many others. The colonists had no immunity to local diseases and limited medical knowledge or supplies. A disease outbreak could have killed many colonists quickly. Environmental challenges. The colonists would have faced hurricanes, floods, droughts, harsh winters, and other environmental stresses they were unprepared for. The Outer Banks region, while appearing temperate, can be brutal, especially to people unfamiliar with surviving in that environment. Isolation. The colonists were completely cut off from England for 3 years. No supplies arrived, no reinforcements came. They had to survive entirely on their own resources, which may have been insufficient. Against this theory, the organized departure. The empty settlement showed signs of organized evacuation, not gradual death. The houses were intact but empty of possessions. If the colonists had died in place from starvation or disease, we would expect to find bodies, scattered possessions, signs of desperate final days. Instead, the site suggests the colonists packed up and left deliberately. Native assistance. The natives of the region lived successfully in this environment. They had food, shelter, and knowledge of how to survive. If colonists were starving, the nearby natives would have known and could have provided food either as trade, as assistance to Mantio's friends, or simply as humanitarian aid. The idea that all the colonists died from starvation while surrounded by native populations who had plenty of food seems implausible. The CROATOAN message. The colonists left a clear message about where they were going. If they were dying in place, they would not have been able to carve this message. The message indicates they were healthy enough to relocate deliberately. No archaeological evidence of mass death. If over 100 people died on Roanoke Island or in its immediate vicinity, we should find graves, skeletal remains, or other evidence of mass mortality. Despite extensive archaeological work on Roanoke Island, no such evidence has been found. Later reports of survivors. The reports that reached Jamestown colonists in the early 1600s suggested some lost colonists or their descendants were still alive. These reports, while frustratingly vague, are inconsistent with the entire colony dying from starvation and disease in the first few years. The starvation-disease theory might explain some deaths. Undoubtedly, some colonists did die from illness, malnutrition, or harsh conditions, but it does not explain the organized departure from Roanoke or the CROATOAN message. Most likely, if starvation and disease played a role, it was in combination with other factors, perhaps forcing the colonists to seek help from native populations. Theory 4. Migration to the interior. This theory, which has gained support from recent archaeological discoveries, proposes that at least some colonists moved inland, possibly to the region near the Chowan River or to other locations along the sounds and rivers of North Carolina. They may have intended to establish the city of Raleigh that was mentioned in planning documents, or they may have been seeking better land, fresh water, or safer locations away from the vulnerable barrier islands. Evidence supporting this theory. Site X. In 2012, archaeologists announced the discovery of Site X, a location about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, where extensive English artifacts from the late 16th century have been found at what appears to be a native village site. The artifacts include pieces of European pottery, nails, and other items consistent with English colonial presence. The site was identified using modern imaging techniques to examine an original map drawn by John White, which showed a hidden symbol at this inland location, possibly indicating a planned settlement site or a location where English might be found. The city of Raleigh. Documents from the period mention plans to establish a city of Raleigh inland from Roanoke. The colonists may have intended Roanoke Island as only a temporary base while they explored for a better permanent site. If they found such a site and moved there, they might have carved CROATOAN as a way station or as a backup plan while intending to continue inland. Native reports to Jamestown. Some of the reports that reached Jamestown colonists mentioned Europeans living in stone houses inland near the Chowan River or other interior rivers. These reports, though second-hand, suggest English presence in the interior, not just on the coast. Strategic logic. The Outer Banks were vulnerable to hurricanes, had limited fresh water, and were difficult to defend. Moving inland to a better protected site with reliable fresh water and more arable land would make strategic sense. The colonists may have recognized within months that Roanoke Island was unsuitable for permanent settlement. Archaeological scatter pattern. English artifacts have been found at multiple sites in eastern North Carolina, suggesting the colonists may have split into smaller groups rather than staying together as one community. Some may have gone to CROATOAN, others inland, others to various native villages where they sought protection or partnership. Against this theory, the CROATOAN message. The colonists carved CROATOAN, not gone inland or moved to Chowan River. If they had moved inland, why point visitors to CROATOAN? Perhaps the message indicated an intermediate stop, or perhaps different groups went to different locations, but the carving specifically says CROATOAN. The difficulty of inland travel. Moving over 100 people, including women and children, 50 or more miles inland through unfamiliar territory would be an enormous undertaking. The colonists would have needed native guides, boats to travel up rivers, and cooperation from the various tribes whose territories they passed through. While not impossible, it would have required careful planning and significant assistance. Limited evidence. While Site X and a few other locations have yielded English artifacts, the amount of material found is relatively small. If over 100 colonists lived inland for years, we might expect more extensive archaeological remains, house foundations, graves, more artifacts. The limited evidence found so far suggests small numbers of English, perhaps a handful of individuals or a single family, not the entire colony. The timeline. If colonists moved inland, when did this happen? Shortly after White left in 1587? Or years later, after first going to CROATOAN? And how did they survive the journey and establish themselves in unfamiliar territory among peoples who may not have been friendly? The migration theory is appealing and has some archaeological support, but it raises as many questions as it answers. Most likely, if there was migration inland, it involved only some colonists, not the entire group. Perhaps different subgroups made different choices, some to CROATOAN, some inland, some staying on Roanoke until conditions forced them to move. Theory 5. The combined scenario. Increasingly, historians believe the truth is not a single, simple explanation, but a complex combination of factors that unfolded over years. This combined scenario theory proposes Phase 1, late 1587 to early 1588. After White's departure, the colonists struggled through the winter of 1587 to 1588. Food shortages, disease, and deteriorating relations with some native tribes made Roanoke Island untenable. Recognizing they could not survive alone, they made plans to relocate. 2. Phase 2, 1588. The colonists moved to CROATOAN Island, where Mantillo's people welcomed them. This explains the CROATOAN carving. It was accurate at the time it was carved. At CROATOAN, the colonists lived in or near native villages, trading their metal goods for food and protection. Some integration began. English men may have married native women, children learned both languages, cultural boundaries began to blur. Phase 3, 1589 to 1590. Over time, the community at CROATOAN faced pressures, population strain from supporting extra mouths, rivalry with mainland tribes, resource depletion. Some colonists may have moved on, either returning to Roanoke to watch for English ships, moving to inland sites where there was better farmland, or scattering to various native communities where individuals or small groups were absorbed. Phase 4, 1590s to early 1600s. Gradual attrition through disease, violence, childbirth complications, old age, and other causes reduced the original colonist population. Surviving colonists and their mixed ancestry children were fully integrated into native communities. English identity faded as the colonists adapted to survive. By the time Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607, 20 years after the colony's founding, few, if any, original colonists remained alive, though their descendants did, now culturally native but carrying some English genetic heritage and perhaps some memories of their English ancestors. This combined scenario fits the evidence better than any single cause theory. It acknowledges that the colonists probably did go to CROATOAN as they said they would. It explains why archaeological evidence is scattered across multiple sites the colonists split up over time. It accounts for the reports of Europeans living with natives. These were colonists or their descendants who had integrated, and it recognizes that 115 people facing impossible circumstances would make different choices with different outcomes over a period of years. The combined scenario is messy, without a single dramatic moment of resolution. There was no single massacre, no single decision to integrate, no single journey inland. Instead, there was a gradual dissolution of the English colony, a slow process of adaptation and integration and attrition that played out over years, leaving scattered traces across the Carolina coast but no concentrated evidence, no mass grave, no intact community that later English visitors could find and identify. This is probably the closest we can come to the truth. The lost colonists were not lost in a moment, but gradually, over years, as they made individual and family choices to survive in a world very different from the one they had left in England. They became ghosts not through death but through transformation, ceasing to be English colonists and becoming something new: Native Americans of mixed heritage, people who lived between worlds, whose stories were told in native oral traditions rather than English documents, whose graves are unmarked and whose bones lie scattered and unidentified across the coastal plains of North Carolina. The search for the lost colony has been ongoing since the early 20th century, when antiquarians and amateur historians first began serious efforts to locate physical evidence of the colonists' fate. These early efforts were often unsystematic and sometimes caused more harm than good, destroying archaeological context in their enthusiasm to find dramatic artifacts. The most notorious early discovery was the Dare Stones controversy of the 1930s and 1940s. In 1937, a stone was found in North Carolina bearing an inscription supposedly carved by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The inscription described the deaths of many colonists from disease and starvation and indicated they had moved inland. The stone caused a sensation, and soon more Dare stones appeared, each with new inscriptions continuing the story. Eventually, nearly 50 Dare stones were found, creating an elaborate narrative of the colonists' fate. However, investigation revealed that most or all of the stones were fraudulent, created by hoaxers who had been inspired by the fame of the first stone. The language used in the inscriptions was wrong for the 16th century. The carving techniques were inconsistent, and no genuine supporting evidence emerged. The Dare stones are now considered an embarrassing chapter in lost colony research, a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful thinking and inadequate skepticism. Serious archaeological work began in the 1940s and 50s at various sites connected to the lost colony. The Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, which preserves the likely location of the settlement on Roanoke Island, has been extensively excavated. These excavations have revealed evidence of the earthwork fort, post holes from buildings, artifacts from both the 1585 and 1587 occupations, and clear evidence of native presence before and after the English arrived. However, excavations at Fort Raleigh have not revealed much about what happened to the colonists. The site was abandoned in an orderly fashion, with most portable items taken by the departing colonists. What remains are things too heavy or mundane to carry: nails, broken pottery, bits of brick and mortar. Nothing has been found that indicates violence, mass death, or the specific fate of individuals. More promising have been excavations at native village sites in the region. In the 1990s and 2000s, systematic archaeological surveys identified dozens of late 16th century native sites in the Outer Banks and nearby mainland. Excavation at these sites has revealed European artifacts, pieces of copper, glass beads, metal tools that demonstrate trade contact between English and natives during the period when the colonists were in the region. The most significant recent discovery has been at Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, the historic home of the CROATOAN people. Excavations there, beginning in the early 2000s and continuing to the present, have uncovered extensive evidence of English presence. The artifacts include a copper ingot of a type known to have been distributed to the lost colonists, parts of English guns, including a snap-haunce firing mechanism, a handled sword blade of English manufacture, food preparation items including iron pot fragments, a gold signet ring with a lion design, possibly belonging to one of the colonists, large amounts of reworked copper, indicating natives were melting down English copper objects to create native-style ornaments. The context in which these items were found in house floors, in trash pits, mixed with native pottery and tools, strongly suggests the items were being used by people living at the site, not simply stored as trade goods. The excavators believe this indicates English colonists were living at Cape Creek in native houses, using both English and native material culture during the period from approximately 1587 to the early 1600s. However, the evidence is still circumstantial. We have not found graves with definitively English skeletal remains. We have not found inscriptions or documents confirming the presence of lost colonists. We have not found a house that is unambiguously English in design rather than native. What we have is a strong circumstantial case that English people were at Cape Creek, living in close contact with the CROATOAN during the right time period. This fits the integration theory perfectly, but it is not absolute proof. The discovery of Site X, announced in 2012, added another dimension to the search. Site X is located near the Salmon Creek area, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke. The site was identified through analysis of John White's original maps using modern imaging techniques that revealed patches on the map that had been covered over, possibly to conceal strategic information from Spanish spies who might capture the map. Under one of these patches was a small symbol, and when archaeologists investigated the location indicated by the symbol, they found a native village site with English artifacts. Modern archaeology has also employed new techniques that were unavailable to earlier researchers. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to search for hidden structures or graves at various sites. Soil chemistry analysis can detect evidence of English-style construction materials or activities. DNA analysis of skeletal remains can potentially identify individuals of European ancestry. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth can determine where people grew up based on their diet and the minerals in their environment. These techniques have not yet produced the breakthrough discovery everyone hopes for: a grave with a skeleton that can be definitively identified as one of the lost colonists, or a cache of artifacts with inscriptions identifying their owners. But they have steadily accumulated evidence supporting the integration theory. English people were living in native communities in eastern North Carolina in the decades after 1587, and the most likely explanation is that at least some of these English people were lost colonists or their descendants. One significant challenge for archaeology is the nature of the environment. The Outer Banks and nearby coastal plain are dynamic landscapes where beaches erode, dunes migrate, rivers change course, and sea level gradually rises. Sites that were inland in the 16th century may now be underwater. Sites that were near the coast may have been eroded away by storms. Organic materials like wood and cloth deteriorate rapidly in the humid climate. Even durable materials like metal corrode in the salt air. This means that much of the archaeological record has been destroyed or is inaccessible. We are looking for evidence of people who lived 430 plus years ago, in an environment that is actively hostile to preservation, in locations that may have shifted or been destroyed. The fact that we have found any evidence at all is remarkable, but it also means we may never find the kind of conclusive proof that would definitively solve the mystery. Another challenge is funding. Archaeological excavation is expensive, time-consuming, and requires specialized expertise. Most of the sites connected to the lost colony are on private property or in environmentally sensitive areas where excavation is difficult to permit. Research institutions and universities can provide some funding, but large-scale excavations require substantial financial support that is often difficult to secure for projects that may not yield dramatic results. Despite these challenges, the archaeological search continues. Each summer, teams of archaeologists return to various sites, carefully excavating, documenting every artifact and feature, slowly building the evidentiary case. They are not searching for treasure or for headlines. They are searching for understanding, for the small details that can illuminate how people lived and what choices they made when faced with impossible circumstances. The archaeologists working on lost colony sites are acutely aware that they are handling the material remains of real people's lives. Every piece of broken pottery, every corroded nail, every fragment of copper was once part of someone's daily existence. Eleanor Dare may have cooked a meal in a pot whose fragments are now carefully catalogued in a lab. Virginia Dare may have played with beads that are now in museum storage. Ananias Dare may have worked metal with tools whose remnants are now oxidized and barely recognizable. Archaeology cannot bring these people back. It cannot tell us their thoughts or their feelings, but it can tell us they were here, that they lived, that they made choices and built lives and left traces in the earth. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes knowing they existed and tried to survive is more important than knowing exactly how their story ended. The lost colony has become more than a historical mystery. It has become a powerful story in American culture, a foundational myth that speaks to themes of exploration, disappearance, survival, and the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans. The story has been told and retold in countless forms, each generation finding in it meanings relevant to their own time. In the 19th century, as Americans pushed westward and built a continental nation, the lost colony story was often framed as a tragedy of brave pioneers who died attempting to plant civilization in the wilderness. This interpretation fit nicely with the ideology of manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were fated to expand across the continent, bringing progress and civilization to savage lands. The lost colonists were martyrs to this cause, their disappearance a sacrifice that preceded later successful colonization. This interpretation gave particular prominence to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. Virginia became a romantic figure, an innocent symbol of new beginnings tragically cut short. Countless poems, stories, and paintings depicted her, usually as a beautiful white child representing the promise of America. Statues of Virginia Dare were erected, including one at Fort Raleigh and another in the National Cathedral in Washington. The Virginia Dare story became a tool for white Americans to claim deep roots in America, to assert that they were not merely conquerors but also victims, that they had suffered and sacrificed in the building of the nation. This romanticization of Virginia Dare reached disturbing extremes in the early 20th century. White supremacist groups co-opted her image, portraying her as the first white American and using her story to support racist ideologies. The lost colony became entangled with nativist movements that sought to restrict immigration and preserve white Protestant dominance. Virginia Dare's name was even given to a brand of wine, a particularly absurd commercialization of the story. A different interpretation emerged in the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, as Americans became more aware of the dark sides of their history. The lost colony began to be understood not just as a story of brave pioneers, but also as a story of colonial invasion, of Europeans arriving uninvited on lands already inhabited, of cultural collision and conflict. This interpretation emphasized the perspective of Native Americans, who had their own stories of English arrival, their own memories of violence and disease and displacement. In this framing, the integration theory took on new significance. If the lost colonists integrated with native tribes, this suggested a path not taken, a possibility of coexistence and mutual adaptation that contrasted with the violence and genocide that characterized much of later American colonial history. The lost colony story became a bittersweet reminder that other outcomes were possible, that Europeans and natives could have built shared communities rather than fighting wars of extermination. Paul Green's outdoor drama, The Lost Colony, which has been performed annually at Fort Raleigh since 1937, except during World War II, reflects these evolving interpretations. The play, which tells the story of the colonists from their arrival to their disappearance, has been revised multiple times over the decades to reflect changing attitudes about colonialism, race, and American identity. Early versions portrayed the natives as exotic and somewhat threatening. Later versions gave native characters more depth and agency, presenting the story as one of two peoples trying to navigate an impossible situation. The show has become a cultural institution in North Carolina, seen by millions of visitors over the decades. It has shaped how many Americans understand the lost colony story, for better or worse. It has also become a venue for debates about how history should be presented, what should be emphasized, what should be omitted, how to balance entertainment with education, how to tell a story respectfully when so much about it remains unknown. In literature, The Lost Colony has inspired numerous novels, from historical fiction attempting to realistically portray the colonists' fate, to fantasy stories imagining supernatural explanations for the disappearance. These works of fiction do what history cannot. They give the colonists voices, thoughts, emotions, complete stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. They are not historically accurate, but they serve an important function. They remind us that these were real people, not just names on a roster, not just artifacts buried in the soil. Lee Miller's Roanoke, Solving the Mystery of the Lost Colony, 2000, is a well-researched popular history that argues for the integration theory, while also exploring the political intrigues in England that delayed whites' return. Andrew Lawler's The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and The Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, 2018, is a more recent work that examines both the historical evidence and the cultural meanings Americans have found in the story. These and many other books keep the lost colony in public consciousness, ensuring new generations encounter the mystery. The story has also appeared in television documentaries, podcasts, and even in genre fiction, where the colonists' disappearance is attributed to time travel, alien abduction, or supernatural forces. These fanciful interpretations are historically worthless, but they demonstrate the story's enduring power to capture imaginations. The mystery is a blank canvas on which people project their interests and anxieties. For Native Americans, particularly those whose ancestors were the CROATOAN, CROATAN, and related peoples, the lost colony story is complicated. On one hand, it is a reminder of the beginning of European invasion, the start of centuries of violence, displacement, and cultural destruction that nearly destroyed their peoples. On the other hand, the integration theory suggests their ancestors may have acted with compassion, taking in desperate English colonists, saving lives, creating hybrid communities. The Lumbee people, who claim descent from lost colonists who integrated with native populations, have complex feelings about the story. Some embrace it as part of their identity, proud that their ancestors adapted and survived. Others find it frustrating that their native heritage is overshadowed by fascination with the English component, as if the native side of their ancestry is less interesting or important. Still others question whether the connection to the lost colony is real or is a myth that developed later, perhaps as a way for marginalized people to claim connection to a famous story. Regardless of its historical accuracy, the Lumbee connection to the lost colony has shaped their community identity and their relationship with the broader American culture. It has been both a source of pride and a burden, allowing them visibility but also sometimes reducing them to footnotes in someone else's story. The lost colony story has also become important to North Carolina's identity and tourism economy. Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, the outdoor drama, museums, historical markers, and countless books and souvenirs sold in the Outer Banks all draw visitors interested in the mystery. The Lost Colony is a brand, a marketable piece of history that brings tourists and their dollars to the region. This commercialization is both necessary and troubling. The revenue supports preservation, education, and ongoing research. But it also commodifies tragedy, turns mystery into entertainment, risks trivializing the real human suffering that occurred. Finding the balance between respectful commemoration and economic development is an ongoing challenge. For historians and archaeologists, the Lost Colony represents an ideal research subject, a genuine mystery with real stakes, a story that matters both for understanding the past and for reflecting on present concerns about colonialism, race, survival, and identity. It is a story that refuses to be fully solved, that continually generates new questions even as some old ones are answered. It is frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. And, for the general public, the Lost Colony remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, a story everyone knows but no one can definitively explain. It is America's original cold case, a missing persons investigation spanning centuries, a mystery that invites everyone to be a detective, to examine the clues, to form theories, to wonder what really happened to those vanished colonists. The cultural legacy of the Lost Colony is thus multi-layered and sometimes contradictory. It is a story of tragedy and hope, of invasion and integration, of disappearance and transformation. It is a mirror in which Americans see reflected their own assumptions about their history, their identity, their relationship to the land and its indigenous peoples. And it is a reminder that history is not just about what we can prove, but also about what we imagine, what we hope, what we fear, and what we choose to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the edge of the known world, to a mystery that has endured for over 4 centuries, to a story that reminds us that history is not just about what we can prove, but also about what we imagine, what we hope to understand, and what we must accept will remain forever beyond our reach. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Good night.